Ron. Thanks for checking this out. It's time for our monthly break from music making and playing Native American flutes to look at some excellent books by Indigenous writers. And since it's December, just past the winter solstice, I thought it might be fun to think about some books that are really great for kind of midwinter reading. Now, I'm doing this in Florida, and today it's going to be well into the 70s, even though it's late December. But a lot of our really fine writers live in places where it really does get cold and snowy in the wintertime, and I'm sure some of you do too. So especially going to be looking at books from Anishinaabe writers and a Blackfeet writer and an Inuit writer. All of these people have communities both in Canada and the U.S. So 3 of these writers are First Nations Canada writers, and 2 are from communities that are here in the States. Now, we have a couple of outliers, and we'll talk about those in more detail when we get to them. All right, let's get started. First up, we have a literary horror novel by a writer who's become one of my favorites over the last few years. The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. This was released in 2020 and was a pretty buzzy book when it was released. Jones is Blackfeet, and this is mostly set in Montana near the Blackfoot Reservation. And a lot of it is during the winter time. Now, this is not a book for the faint of heart. It can get rather graphic in places and disturbing. Has one of the most terrifying snow chase scenes that I am aware of. But beneath the surface, there's a lot of worthwhile social commentary, a lot of deep thinking about cultural identity and what it means and what it can cost us when we let go of our understanding of how to relate to the world around us, because that's at the heart of this. Some of the young men have taken an action that has put the community out of balance with the world around it. So balance needs to be restored, and sometimes that can be very, very painful. It's a fascinating read on many levels. Can't recommend it highly enough. Just about anything by Stephen Graham Jones is worth a look. The great Louise Erdrich has had a really strong influence on a lot of our younger Indigenous writers. In fact, Stephen Graham Jones cites her book Antelope Woman as influencing The Only Good Indians, which we just looked at. So it was really tempting to recommend that along with Jones's book, but I decided to go with something a bit more recent, The Knight Watchman. This was also released in 2020. The Knight Watchman in question here is actually modeled on Louise Erdrich's grandfather. This is set in the 1950s. This is a time when the U.S. government was once again trying to terminate a lot of our Native American tribes. In this case, they were trying to kind of nullify treaties that guaranteed land base and a certain degree of sovereignty for the communities. And Louise's grandfather led the fight in his community to preserve their treaty rights. And so this novel is a fictionalized retelling of that story. A lot of very beautiful winter writing in it as well. The book begins in September of 1953 and kind of goes through the winter months. Sometimes winter can be kind of a metaphor for struggle, or, can we hang on until that new hope of spring arrives? And there's a little bit of that feeling in this book as well. There are some really interesting experiences that her grandfather has in the very, very cold weather of his community's winter. And so, I've talked about this before, but it's probably a good time to talk about it again. When you relate to the universe in a particular way, when you have a particular understanding of how things work and your place and how to relate to what's going on around you, you might have experiences that outsiders looking in might interpret as being magical or supernatural. And so I sometimes will see reviewers or critics looking at a lot of books by our Indigenous writers and labeling them as magical realism because of something that happens within the book. But it's important to understand that even if it's an unusual experience, we usually will interpret it as being part of the way the universe works and not necessarily magical or supernatural. And so those labels aren't always really helpful in trying to understand what's going on in some of these books. So just kind of keep that in mind, because these kinds of experiences crop up pretty regularly in writings by Indigenous authors. Louise Erdrich is Anishinaabe, and her community is in the United States. Our next writer is also Anishinaabe, but his community is in Canada. His name is Wabgishig Rice, and the book is Moon of the Crusted Snow. This is set among his people in Canada in the wintertime. Now, I think Rice cut his teeth mainly as a journalist. I believe this is his first novel. It's speculative fiction, and the premise here is that the dominant culture's infrastructure has collapsed just as winter is approaching. And so an Anishinaabe community that has become kind of dependent on that infrastructure is left on its own. It's going to have to find a way to survive through a difficult and cold winter. And so the question is, not only can they remember enough of the old ways to survive, just from a technical sense, but maybe even more importantly, can they remember the old ways of being a community so that they can work together and make sure that as many of them survive as possible? So it's a kind of a slow burn. Will they make it to springtime or not? A really good examination, again, of cultural identity, what makes us who we are, how do we relate to each other in a productive and life-sustaining way. Next up is another book by a First Nations Anishinaabe writer, and I guess that makes 3 books in a row by Anishinaabe writers. This one is by Richard Wagamese, and it's called Indian Horse. Now, I don't think Wagamese's work is as well known as it should be in the States, but in Canada, it's highly, highly admired for good reason. If you're into hockey, you might want to give this book a go. There's lots of hockey playing in the book, and the in-game descriptions are really first-rate, as much as I can tell, not being a hockey expert, really. But be aware that it's not one of those cliched, our hero, the underdog, overcomes all odds and rises up triumphant through the majestic power of sports. It's just not that. There's a lot more going on here. The lead character here has endured the Catholic residential school experience. Historically, Canada's treatment of Indigenous people is no better than the United States, and the residential school experience is part of the history in both countries. If you're not familiar, these are places where oftentimes young Indigenous kids would be forcibly removed from their homes and sent to a residential school far away, where they would be, in effect, force assimilated. They would be forced to wear their hair in the dominant culture way and dress like dominant culture people, and they would be beaten if they spoke their home language instead of English. Oftentimes, there would be severe physical punishments for the most minor infractions of school rules. Sexual abuse was common. A lot of the kids did not survive the experience. So that's what our young lead character has gone through in this book. So there's a fair amount of darkness and pain to go along with a lot of beauty and some exciting hockey. Now, it has been made into a film recently, and I haven't seen it, but it's getting really good reviews up in Canada. Last I saw, it's available on Netflix. Clint Eastwood does have a producer credit, so I think it was done in good faith, and there are lots of stories of elders being invited onto the set to make sure things were being done respectfully and correctly and doing proper ceremony and all of that kind of thing. So if you want to check out the movie, see if it's still on Netflix. But in the meantime, be sure to check out the book. It's really worth the read. I've already talked about the next book on another video, so I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail here, but I will put a link in the description box so you can go check that out if you want to. It's just that it's so perfect for winter books, I had to include it here too. It's actually written by one of my favorite musicians on the planet, Inuit throat singer Tanya Tagaq, and it's called Split Tooth. This is the paperback version. The hardback edition has the same graphics with just the colors reversed, so it's still easy to find. It's kind of hard to put a label on this book. It has elements of contemporary literary fiction. There are mythological elements. There's some beautiful poetry, all put in the service of telling a coming-of-age story about a young woman who's being raised in an Inuit community in the far north. There's some difficult issues in this book around domestic violence and sexual abuse, so just be aware of that if those issues are triggering at all for you. But there's also some really uplifting and beautiful writing, especially about being outdoors and experiencing the cold and the ice and the snow, connecting with the northern lights, all kinds of good stuff. In all of the books we've looked at so far, the author was dealing with the traditional lands of their people. We're going to change it up a little bit for the next book. This is a volume of poetry by one of my very favorite poets, Simon J. Ortiz, and it's called After and Before the Lightning. Ortiz is from Acoma Pueblo, so that's in the kind of desert southwest of what's now the United States. But this volume of poetry grew out of his experience of spending a long, hard, cold winter on the Rosebud Lakota Reservation in the Dakotas. So we have a poet here, a very sensitive poet, connecting with the land of another indigenous people and describing his experience, and it is really powerful stuff. I remember reading this here in Florida in August and getting up at one point and turning off the air conditioning because I was beginning to feel cold just from the writing. It's a substantial book of poetry. A lot of contemporary books of poetry that I look at are maybe 70, 80 pages long, and sometimes it's like, a single haiku-length poem on each page. This is about 130 pages, and they are mostly densely covered pages. So it's an adventurous read, a challenging read from a poetic standpoint, and very beautiful to hear about his experience. The last book today is especially for you if you are sitting someplace where it's cold and snowy and you can't figure out why you would want to read a book about being someplace cold and snowy. So even though this book, part of it is set during months that would be winter months in the Northern Hemisphere, it's set in Australia, so there's no snow involved. It's by one of my very favorite Indigenous writers, Alexis Wright from the Wanye people. It is called The Swan Book. Now, the more I read of Indigenous writers from the Pacific areas, writers from Australia, the more I feel that their worldview is very similar to the worldview that those of us have here as Indigenous people in the Americas. In fact, they feel like very, very close cousins. And a lot of times reading Alexis Wright feels to me like sitting around a fire, listening to a great Indigenous storyteller do their thing. If you've read many books by Native American writers, the themes in the Swan Book might feel familiar. There are issues here of colonialism and how do we recover from that toxic experience. So issues of cultural identity and personal identity. There are Indigenous communities that decide to assimilate and play games with the government. And so, of course, they get special treatment. And then there are also Indigenous communities that resist assimilation and, in effect, are punished for that. And all of this is in the service of a story of a young woman who has one of my very favorite character names in all of literature. Her name is Etheline Oblivion. She often goes just by Oblivia in this book. She has kind of a rough journey, but it's very, very beautifully told by Alexis Wright. If you're not familiar with her work, the Swan Book is a wonderful place to start. Thanks for hanging out. It's time for me to get back to the music studio. I'll be back in about a month with more great books by Indigenous writers. But in the meantime, please check back in for music making videos and Native American flute playing tips. See you next time.